And joining us now from Capitol Hill, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, whose name is also being floated as a possible running mate for the former president. Senator Scott, welcome. So let's start with your endorsement of former President Trump and why you chose him over fellow South Carolinian Nikki Haley.
You know, it's kind of a simple answer, to be honest with you. There's no doubt that President Trump had 4 amazing years from a policy perspective. You think about what he did for the country. He united the country because success begets success. We have the lowest unemployment rates for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Asians, a 70-year low for women, and a 50-year low for the majority population. Those kinds of numbers actually brings America together. In addition to that, we saw the fastest wage growth at the bottom of the income. That's great news for everyday working Americans who are working paycheck to paycheck, trying to pay their bills. Their income grew at the bottom quintile about 5%, comparatively speaking, to the top quintile, around 2.7%. But even beyond that, you think about things that are really important to families, like education. President Trump put the most money in HBCUs in the history of the country at the time. He also made their funding permanent. He focused on bringing relief and hope to people living in poverty through my opportunity zones. Today, over $75 billion committed, only possible because President Trump helped me get it across the finish line.
Senator, do you think it's time for Nikki Haley to get out of the race?
Oh, I think it's past time for Nikki to get out of the race. Listen, she was a good governor and we thank her for her service, but the best thing she can do for the future of the country right now is to get out of the race so that this race becomes between President Trump and Joe Biden. It's where we already are, but every day that we are distracted by a primary is a day that we don't focus on lowering inflation for the average millennial so they can buy a house. It's another day that we don't focus on reducing crime by reestablishing law and order. It's another day that we don't focus on refunding the police as opposed to the current conversation around defunding the police. Every day she's in the way is a day the American people suffer through more Bidenomics.
Your name is being talked about a lot as a possible running mate for the former president. What conversations, Senator, have you had with Trump about the possibility of being his running mate?
I've said to the president something very clear. I'm not going to ask you for anything specific. What I will tell you, Mr. President, is that whatever it takes to get you across the finish line, count me in for a couple of reasons. Number one, America is better off with 4 more years of Donald Trump and no more years of Joe Biden. I've said very clearly that the mission of accomplishing the goal of 4 more years is far more important than the position that might be something I would seek.
How do you see yourself as a potential running mate? What would that role look like? You know, in your campaign, you talked a lot about optimism. I'm curious if you kind of see yourself as that happy warrior for the cause.
Yes. Well, there's no doubt if for whoever becomes the running mate to President Trump, you want to bring something that's a contrast, something that's complementary to who he is. So President Trump is a counterpuncher. He's a fighter. Well, that ain't question. He's tenacious. He gets things done because he's like sometimes a bull in a china shop. He likes the conflict. That's good news when we want the world to respect us. The running mate for the president should reflect a temperament that brings people together, that allows for us to build the kind of coalition that allows us to be successful in November. In my opinion, you want a vice president who takes care of the border by securing it, not like Kamala Harris, who the current border czar simply has spent so little time on the border, it's hard to understand what she understands about the border. You'd want a vice president who appreciates law and order, not a vice president who actually helps to fund the release of someone who's later charged with murder. You want a vice president who understands the inner workings of government and someone who's actually led legislative priorities of the president, unlike Kamala Harris, who literally has just sunk into Bidenomics, and that's been devastating to our country.
You mentioned bringing people together. You know, across the country, you see this movement of Republicans who call themselves never Trumpers. If he does win the nomination like he's expected to, how does the party work to win back never Trump voters?
I think we do the same thing we would do for all Americans. This should not be about Republicans or Democrats or even independents. This should be about America's future. And the strongest path to America's future is to make sure that we have a tax code that produces better results so that the average family has more money in their pocket, not less money like they do under Bidenomics. If we're going to unite the country, we can't have racial preferences and gender preferences and religious preference like Joe Biden and the Democrats. We'll have to unite the country by saying we're going to see every single American as an opportunity to push this nation forward together. If we do that, then we'll create the most inclusive economy. If we do that, we'll close our southern border. If we do that, we'll focus on the issues that they tell us are their priorities. And by doing so, we'll have the greatest, brightest future possible for all of America. I believe that is the winning message for President Trump, not just to attract all Republicans to vote for him, but also independents and even some Democrats. Honestly, we saw that in Michigan recently. In Michigan, what we saw was President Trump overperform because he's not talking about union workers or non-union workers. He's talking about American workers and making sure American workers have lots to do and they get the job done better than any other worker on the planet. That kind of confidence is good for America.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on McConnell stepping down as the Senate Republican leader in November. Anything you might add to that?
You know, we always thank Senator McConnell for his service. Certainly, he has served this nation he's the longest sitting, longest standing leader in America's history. What we need to continue to do is make sure that we have 4 more years of Donald Trump, win the majority back in the Senate, actually hold on to the majority in the House, and then go to work with our new leaders with a strong agenda focused on the American people.
Senator, when it comes to a potential shutdown, do you see a path forward for a deal to keep the government running?
Well, the good news is my understanding of the 4 corners, we call that the Speaker, the Minority Leader, the Leader of the Senate, and the Minority Leader in the Senate. Those 4 folks have been meeting and having a serious conversation that it looks like we will avoid a government shutdown. That's good news.
Today, you tweeted, this is a quote, "Here's a dose of reality. Our border is wide open and American lives are at risk because of the president, but the president refuses to enforce the laws on the books." What steps, Senator, would you like to see the president take to secure the border?
Well, the most important step President Biden could do to secure our border is to do what President Trump already did. He started building a border wall. A large physical impediment reduces the number of illegal crossings. I was just in Eagle Pass, Texas, less than 10 days ago. And one of the things that the Border Patrol agents told me was the importance of having a physical impediment. That plus the Remain in Mexico policy are 2 things that the current president could do right now to close our southern border. And let's use all the technology already available and sometimes rusting in shelters near the border. If we just did those 3 things, we could reduce precipitously the number of illegal crossings. And in addition to that, 70,000 Americans who've lost their lives to fentanyl could still be alive if we had a closed southern border. This should be a priority for any administration.
I want to ask you about the issue of IVF and frozen embryos. Do you agree with the Alabama Supreme Court? Where do you stand on that issue, and do you think the ruling needs to be rectified somehow?
There's certainly no question that we should protect IVF. It's an important part of bringing life to our country and, frankly, life to the world. And so I'm a strong supporter of IVF. I think the Supreme Court and the Alabama legislator needs to make the decision to fix the problem. Doing so, I think, will send a positive message to all the women who today have been waiting and in fear, trying to figure out what their next steps are if IVF was their alternative.
And finally, Senator, new Gallup polling shows only 13% of Americans approve of the job Congress is doing. Can you understand that and the frustration, and how are you addressing that?
Well, there's no doubt that Congress has always had a pretty low approval rating, and certainly having been there for a little while, I can understand why. The good news is the fastest path to improving our ratings, frankly, do our jobs. At the end of the day, focusing on America's priorities, securing the southern border, fixing the broken economy and restoring law and order in our country is the way for us not to simply improve our polls, but to improve the quality of life that our citizens are experiencing. That should be our objective.
All right, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, great to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Have a good day.